The bowl trembled in her hands. Steam curled from the surface of the thick stew, dark, oily, speckled with strange spices. The smell was unlike anything she had known. Bold, smoky, foreign. Around her, other women stared at their plates with suspicion and fear. Some whispered warnings. One made the sign of the cross. Another spat on the floor in defiance. "It must be a trick," someone muttered. "Poison." But the man who had made it, tall, sunburned, with a cowboy hat crooked on his head, only smiled gently and said, "Ain't much, but it's from the heart." She'd been trained to expect cruelty, raised to believe Americans were beasts. Yet here he was, serving food cooked by his own hands. No orders, no punishments, just stew, bread, and quiet eyes. She took one breath, one bite, and everything she'd believed began to unravel. It wasn't just a meal. It was a betrayal of everything she thought she knew. The bowl still trembled between her palms as the dusty light of the camp filtered through the warped wooden slats above, casting slow-moving shadows over the women gathered around the long mess hall tables. Outside, the dry wind dragged itself across the yard, rattling loose tin roofing and stirring the faint smell of horses from the nearby paddock. Inside, silence clung to the air like smoke. No one spoke, no one dared. For in this camp, nestled somewhere between American order and wartime uncertainty, every gesture still felt like a test. The women of the former empire had lived for years under the certainty that the enemy was merciless, dishonorable, even monstrous. That belief had become a kind of armor, thin but reliable. And yet here, on this strange late autumn afternoon, a single bowl of stew threatened to shatter its shell. They had woken, as they always did, to the clang of the iron bell. A guard marched them in lines toward chores, their footsteps crunching over the gravel path that cut through the camp like a pale scar. Laundry duty, field work, sorting scrap metal, each assignment delivered with clipped commands and watchful eyes. The women obeyed quietly, heads bowed, hands folded against the cold. Even now, months after their capture, their bodies still tensed at every shout, every slam of a door, every flash of a soldier's boots against sunlight. Survival meant reading danger in even the smallest sound. Distrust lived in their bones, and so when lunchtime arrived and the women entered the mess hall, the last thing they expected was change. Another tray of thin soup, perhaps, hard bread, bitter coffee, predictable, meager, safe. Instead, they were ambushed by the smell of something thick, smoky, almost sweet. A scent carried straight from the open plains, raw and bold, clinging to the air like a foreign language. At the far end of the room stood a tall man with broad shoulders and dust-stained boots, a crooked hat hanging on a nail behind him. He stirred a massive pot with a wooden ladle, humming a quiet tune that rose and fell like a slow-moving river. The women whispered among themselves. Some shrank away from the counter. Others narrowed their eyes, studying the stranger as though he were a puzzle meant to deceive. Rumors flew. He was a drifter, a ranch hand, a man who belonged to the deserts and pastures of distant Texas. But what unsettled them most was not the hat, nor the accent, nor the relaxed ease of his posture. It was the simple truth that he was cooking. Not rations, not military provisions, food that carried memories, choices, intention. The stew he offered was not on any camp list. He had gathered the ingredients himself. Smoked meat from a neighboring town, onions dried in the sun, peppers brought from a local farm, spices tucked in his pockets from home. The pot simmered with a homespun defiance, as if he had poured pieces of his past into it. "Ain't fancy," he murmured when questioned by a guard. But my mama made it when times were hard." The women stared, bewildered. Why would an enemy share something born from comfort? When their turn came, the ladle dipped and rose, heavy with dark broth and tender meat. A bowl was set before each woman. Some refused to touch it. Others nudged it with their spoons, watching the surface tremble. One claimed it must be punishment disguised as kindness. Another insisted it was a trap meant to soften them before humiliation. But then came the bite, the first bite. One woman, smaller than the rest, lifted the spoon with trembling fingers. She swallowed. Her eyes widened. A breath hitched in her throat. The stew was smoky, warm, alive, and in that instant something inside her shifted, not with violence, but with the quiet pressure of truth too large to ignore. The enemy's food did not taste like cruelty. It tasted like home. But before the stew, before the warmth of broth and the kindness of calloused hands, there was only silence and sacrifice. The woman who now sat at the edge of a dusty American mess hall, spoons still hovering near her lips, had once knelt on polished wooden floors in a school for imperial auxiliaries. There, surrounded by portraits of fallen soldiers and the scent of burning incense, she had sworn a different kind of oath, one etched not in paper, but into marrow. Better death than capture, they were taught. Shame is eternal. For months, she and the other girls marched until their feet bled, recited chants until their voices cracked, and learned how to bandage wounds without emotion, stitch flesh without pause, and lie to mothers without trembling. They were not trained to be soldiers, but shadows, silent, devoted, invisible supporters of the Emperor's will. Obedience was their currency, questioning a punishable offense. Even before the war swallowed Japan, the war had already entered their minds. To them, surrender was not merely weakness. It was erasure, the absence of honor, the final unforgivable act. Rations had long since shriveled by the time the war reached its crescendo. In the cities, queues for rice stretched down cracked alleys. Children's bellies swelled from hunger. Lanterns dimmed early to save fuel. Rumors whispered through the streets like ghosts about the American bombers, about the islands falling one by one, about girls gone missing. In the auxiliary wards where the woman worked, the air always smelled faintly of mold, iodine, and dried blood. She treated the wounded with shaking hands, but never cried. Crying was a Western indulgence, they said, a luxury Japan could no longer afford. They were shown films between shifts, grainy reels that painted Americans as grotesque creatures, teeth too large, skin too red, eyes too empty. "You must not pity them," an officer had warned, the same way he might speak of dogs or disease. "They are devils in flesh. They will not spare you." And so the fear took root. It grew under their uniforms, threaded itself through their prayers. It hardened into truth. The woman remembered the night she was captured. The final air raid had left the shoreline glowing red behind her. She and the others had hidden in a half-collapsed aid station, crouched behind crates of rusting instruments and broken radios. When the boots came, they braced for horror. One of the women had tried to bite her own tongue off. Another raised a jagged piece of mirror to her neck. Better to die by their own hands than to be defiled. That was what they had always been told, but the violence never came. Instead, a soldier with a faded photo of a child pinned inside his helmet offered them water. Another passed out wool blankets. They were spoken to, not barked at, not leered at. And when the women were loaded onto trucks, it was with a strange and careful silence, as if the men handling them understood that even kindness could be a kind of trauma. Still, the woman had not spoken for days after her arrival. She did not eat, not properly. She held her body like a locked chest. Even when the camp's guards addressed her in halting Japanese, even when the nurse brought aspirin for her headaches, she saw only masks. She waited for the cruelty beneath. It would come. It had to, but then came the stew and the man in the crooked hat. And the moment she realized she had not seen a single whip, not heard a single slap, not felt a single hand raised in rage, only the creak of boots on wood, the shuffle of cards in the guardhouse, the wind across the plains. What if they had lied to her? What if mercy wasn't weakness? What if surrender had not killed her but saved her? The thought clung to her like a thorn in her chest, impossible to ignore once it pierced through. And at the center of it all stood the man in the hat. The quiet American with smoke in his clothes and gentleness in his eyes. He was not a figure of power. He didn't bark orders or carry a pistol. He didn't wear his uniform like armor. His boots were worn, his sleeves always rolled, and his hat, that crooked, sun-faded Stetson, sat like an afterthought on the nail behind the mess counter. But somehow he commanded more attention than any captain. The women called him the man from the plains, in whispers. They watched him with guarded eyes, unsure whether to laugh or fear him. He looked nothing like the monsters they had been warned about. He was tall, yes, and his face had the lines of someone who had squinted into too many sunrises. But his hands were steady and stained, not with blood, but with spice and smoke and soil. He had once been a rancher, someone said, from a place called Amarillo, where the earth rolled flat and wide, and the sky seemed to stretch forever. He had traded cattle before the war, and played harmonica at campfires, sang to the stars, and cooked for every drifter who passed through his mother's porch. He did not speak much, but when he did, his voice carried the slow warmth of a man who didn't need to prove anything. "Food tells the truth," he once said to a young private, shrugging as he sliced dried meat with a battered pocket-knife. "Even when people lie, food don't. It either warms the belly or it don't." No one had ordered him to make stew. It hadn't come down through military channels. It wasn't in the camp menu, wasn't in the budget, and certainly wasn't in the rule book, but he had done it anyway. Some guards muttered about regulations, others just shook their heads and called him crazy, but he didn't seem to care. He took leftovers from supply trucks, bartered quietly with locals for onions and beans, and spent long mornings before sunrise tending to a pot over open flame behind the kitchen. The guards didn't know what to make of him. To them, he was both part of the machine and completely outside it. He saluted late. He hummed songs they didn't recognize. He handed out food like it was communion. More than once, a lieutenant pulled him aside to ask what his intentions were, and he'd simply reply, "I ain't got any." But of course he did. Just not the kind that could be measured in reports. Somewhere along the road from Amarillo to this camp, he had seen enough. Enough broken bodies, enough hollow eyes, enough silent meals eaten with trembling hands. He wasn't trying to win hearts and minds. He just wanted to offer a moment of dignity where there was none. The women didn't know all this, of course. They only saw the surface, the man who ladled stew with care, who fixed the back gate when it stuck, who set a bird's nest back in its rafters after a storm. But they felt it in the quiet between bites, in the way he looked at them not as enemies, but as people who had lost more than they'd ever say. He never asked them their names, never pressed them to speak. But his presence began to settle like morning fog, soft, almost invisible, but everywhere. And slowly, one by one, the women who once flinched at the clang of boots began to lean forward, breathing in the scent of something that felt almost like peace. But peace was dangerous. Peace could be a trick. In the minds of women raised beneath banners of loyalty and sacrifice, peace was not to be trusted, especially when it came ladled in a bowl offered by the hands of an enemy. The stew, warm and fragrant, had the power to quiet their stomachs, yes, but it also stirred something far more perilous: doubt. And doubt, in the world they came from, was not weakness. It was treason. They sat at the tables in uneasy silence, the bowls before them still steaming. The smell was intoxicating, rich, earthy, unlike anything they had known in years. But for some, that made it all the more suspect. Some women leaned in, sniffed cautiously, then pushed the food away. Others whispered behind their hands, eyes darting toward the guards and then back to the man in the hat. "It's too kind," one muttered. "They're trying to confuse us." Another insisted, "They want us to lower our guard. That's when they'll strike." In Japan, food was not just nourishment, it was ritual, it was identity. Rice was sacred, miso was medicine, and every ingredient carried memory. To take food from an enemy, to accept it into the body, felt like contamination, like swallowing shame. Some women hid their bowls under their coats, sneaking out of the hall, only to bury the stew in the dry earth behind the barracks. Others waited until the guards turned away and poured it into the wash buckets. One woman pretended to eat, but only moved her spoon in circles, whispering a silent prayer to her mother, as if she feared her ancestors might be watching. Still, the scent lingered in the air, wrapping around them like a blanket. Hunger and fear did battle behind their eyes. There was no order from above, no command telling them what to do. Just a bowl, a choice, and the unbearable weight of uncertainty. The nurse sat among them, hands clasped around her bowl like it might vanish if she let go. The first bite had caught her off guard. She hadn't expected it to taste like anything, or at least not like that. It was smoky, yes, but not heavy. There was something tender in it, something warm. She had tasted beans, cumin, a trace of something sweet she could not name, and something else, something she hadn't felt in years: comfort. Now, as the others debated and recoiled, she looked down again. The stew had gone cooler, the surface a still mirror. She glanced around, half expecting someone to shout, to accuse her of betrayal. But no one noticed. They were too busy whispering their fears into the cracks of the wooden walls. She took the second bite. This one went down slower. She let the flavors roll across her tongue, not rushing to swallow. The bitterness she expected never came. Instead, she felt her shoulders loosen, her heartbeat settle. It was just food, but it was not just food, it was a crack in the wall, a softness where there should have been steel, and something began to ache inside her. Not pain, exactly, more like memory. She remembered sitting with her brother beside a coal stove during one rare winter with enough rice to go around. She remembered her mother humming in the kitchen, hands moving with graceful precision. She remembered laughing. It had felt ordinary. But now, years later, that ordinary moment returned to her with the force of something sacred. She took a third bite, and for the first time since arriving in the camp, she felt the weight of her indoctrination begin to shift, not break, not yet, but shift. As if her body knew something her mind could not yet accept, that kindness could live in strange places, even in a bowl, even from a cowboy, even in America. The thought startled her so deeply that she lowered her spoon and stared at her trembling hands, unsure whether she had crossed an invisible border inside herself. Yet the days that followed pushed her even further across it, not with force, but with paper. Thin sheets of rough beige paper handed out one quiet morning as the guards walked down the line of women. a pencil for each, a single simple instruction. You may write home. The reaction rippled through the camp like a shock wave. Some women gasped, others froze. A few clutched the paper to their chests as if it might dissolve. For so long, communication had been a distant dream. Something severed the moment they were captured. Letters meant connection. Letters meant being seen. But they also meant danger. Because whatever they wrote would be read by Japanese eyes long before their families ever touched the envelopes. Censorship was not a rumor. It was law. And back home, the war's propaganda machine was still operating with the efficiency of a steel trap. The nurse held the pencil like a scalpel. Her heart thudded, heavy with the weight of possibility. What did one say after vanishing from the world, after surviving what should have been unthinkable shame? Her family had likely assumed her dead, or worse, dishonored. She pictured her mother lighting incense for her spirit, her father standing stiffly at the edge of the tatami, jaw clenched. Her brother refusing to speak her name aloud. She pressed the pencil tip to the page, but the words would not come. How could she write the truth? How could she describe the stew, the cowboy, the unexpected humanity? To admit such things was to betray everything they had been taught. But to lie, to fabricate cruelty where there was none, felt like poisoning her own memories. All around her, the other women grappled with the same silent war. Some scribbled quickly, as though eager to reassure their families that they remained loyal, unbroken, untouched by enemy softness. Others chewed their lips and stared at the blank space, the emptiness whispering back at them. Finally, she began, slowly, carefully, mapping her thoughts like stepping stones across a river. I am alive, she wrote first, because she knew that alone would make her mother weep. Then, the Americans have treated us differently than expected. She paused, heart pounding, erased nothing, continued, and finally, the sentence she feared and needed most. They gave us stew. It smelled like smoke. I think it was made with kindness. She did not know why she wrote it. The words felt small, almost foolish. But they were truth, and truth, once spoken, refused to be silenced. When the letters were collected, they were stacked neatly into a canvas mailbag, fragile confessions traveling across an ocean. But they would not reach their families untouched. Somewhere in a dim censor's office in Tokyo, officials opened each envelope, scanning for treason. What they found instead was something far more dangerous: praise, gratitude, glimpses of American decency. These letters were not just mail, they were ideological bombs, words that contradicted years of propaganda, words that complicated the narrative that surrender meant torment. One official reportedly muttered, "These women have been deceived," before striking out lines with thick black ink. Another shredded entire pages, horrified by descriptions of American blankets or the taste of real salt. But some lines slipped through. Some phrases survived the censor's knife. And when they reached small wooden homes in Kansai, fishing villages in Shikoku, and cramped tenements in Osaka, families read them with trembling fingers, alive, safe, fed. For some, it sparked relief. For others, confusion. For a few, a quiet, painful hope that maybe the world outside Japan was not the monster they'd been taught to fear. The nurse did not know this yet. She only knew she had written the truth. And that truth now lived somewhere far away, traveling on thin paper, changing the world one careful word at a time. But truth had a price, and for many of the women in the camp, the cost was shame. It clung to them in the silence after meals, in the way eyes avoided one another across the dusty yard. They had been raised to believe in an unshakable hierarchy: the emperor, the homeland, the duty of sacrifice. that America, the enemy, could offer comfort. Even something as simple as a bowl of stew felt like a betrayal not just of country, but of self. Pride collided with hunger. Tradition battled the senses. The quiet enjoyment of a meal became its own form of treason. It was in this strange emotional wilderness that guilt took root. Some women began fasting again, refusing the stew when it was served, not because it tasted bad, but because it tasted too good. Others sat in silent penance, eating mechanically, avoiding the urge to close their eyes and savor. A few whispered prayers before each bite, as if to cleanse the food of its origin. In the barracks, the shame grew louder. One night, with the shadows long and voices low, a confrontation erupted. A woman from Sasebo, rigid, sharp-spoken, her hair always pulled back into a perfect knot, stood at the center of the room, arms crossed like a commander. "They want you to love them," she hissed. "Don't you see? That's what this is. That's what the bacon is. They want us to forget." Someone shifted uneasily on the cot nearby. "They are feeding us to weaken us. And you sit there like stray dogs, wagging your tails for stew." Her eyes locked onto the nurse, who had just returned from the mess. "You're all falling in love with bacon, like children." No one responded. The accusation was too raw, and perhaps too close to something real. But then, from the far end of the barracks, a voice rose, soft, hesitant, yet impossible to ignore. "Maybe." It was a clerk from Yokohama, barely more than a girl. "Maybe what scares you isn't the stew." The silence tightened. "Maybe it's that you liked it." The woman from Sasebo scoffed, but the blow had landed. Everyone felt it. Not just because it was bold, but because it was true. The fear wasn't just of poison or enemy tricks or humiliation. The fear was that something warm and kind could come from the other side of the line. That the stories they'd been fed about brutality and beasts were cracked open by something as humble as a bowl of beans. The nurse said nothing. She didn't need to. She remembered the second bite, the third. The memory of her mother's kitchen, the ache that had surfaced, unexpected and soft. No more was said that night. But something shifted, not all at once, not in a moment of unity, but in quiet gestures, a bowl eaten without hesitation, a whispered thank you to a guard, a gaze held longer than before. The shame didn't vanish, but it made space for something else, something uncertain but undeniably human. And when the stew returned the next evening, most of the women accepted it, some with gratitude, some with guilt, some with both. But they ate. And that, in itself, was a revolution. And revolutions, the quiet kind, rarely come with fanfare. They unfold like seasons, slow, uncertain, almost invisible at first. In the weeks that followed, the cowboy became less of a mystery and more of a presence. He never spoke much, never preached. But the way he moved, hat tipped low, boots scuffing the gravel, humming old Western tunes under his breath, brought a rhythm to the camp that hadn't existed before. It wasn't joy, not exactly, but it was something gentler than survival. It was the cowboy who suggested they plant a garden. He said it casually one morning, as a few of the women swept the walkway outside the mess hall. "This soil ain't much," he muttered, "but it'll take if you give it a reason to." In his hand he held a small paper packet of seeds, cabbage, carrot, onion. "Grow something," he said, offering them not like orders, but like gifts. The guards didn't object. Maybe they didn't care, or maybe they sensed the gesture was harmless, or even helpful. So, near the back fence, just beyond the shadows of the laundry lines, a small plot was cleared. The women dug with mess spoons and bare hands. They watered with old canteen bottles, and slowly green shoots rose through the cracked earth. It wasn't just a garden. It was proof that life could begin again in the unlikeliest of places, that something could grow, even here. One afternoon, when the sun had softened and the air smelled faintly of turned soil, the cowboy brought out a guitar. It was worn, like him, the wood dulled from years of play, the strings uneven. No one knew where he'd found it. Perhaps it had been shipped in a care package. Perhaps it had always been with him. He sat on the step of the kitchen, resting the guitar on his knee like an old friend, and began to play. Not a song the women recognized. No lyrics, at least not at first. Just a slow, steady melody, something wistful and wide, like wind across an open plain. The music drifted through the camp like smoke. The nurse stopped mid-step. Another woman, wringing laundry, froze with the shirt still clutched in her fists. No one had expected it to move them, but it did, not because they understood the tune, but because the sound was soft, unarmed. It filled the empty space without demanding anything in return. Some women turned their backs, pretending not to listen. Others wept quietly. For many, it was the first music they had heard in years that wasn't a marching song or a funeral dirge. The nurse sat beneath the clothes line and listened. She didn't think of her old home. She didn't picture her brother in uniform or her mother's shrine. Instead, she imagined something she'd never allowed herself before, a place that was not Japan, not war, not duty, a place where people could sit in the same sun, eat from the same bowl, and not hate each other. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was possibility, and that alone was dangerous enough to make her heart ache. She looked at the garden, at the tendrils pushing through soil. She looked at the man with the guitar, playing his strange, mournful tune. And for the first time since the war had swallowed her life whole, she let herself imagine a world that was not built on obedience or sacrifice, but on small, ordinary kindnesses. One note, one seed, one meal at a time. The morning began like any other, dry sun, gravel dust, the low hum of chores unfolding in rhythm. But beneath the familiar routine, something felt off. There was a quiet tension in the way the guards moved, straighter spines and tighter steps, as if they were bracing for a performance. Word passed through the camp like wind. Visitors were coming. Not soldiers, not commanders, but a Red Cross delegation. Outsiders tasked with assessing the condition of the prisoners. The women, caught between habit and hope, readied themselves as best they could. They straightened their uniforms, brushed dirt from their sleeves, and waited with that practiced blend of resignation and suspicion. When the delegation arrived, it did so with surprising gentleness. 3 officials, 1 American, 2 Europeans, accompanied by translators and notebooks, moved slowly through the camp. They inspected the barracks with reserved curiosity, commented softly on the laundry lines, and stopped at the mess to inquire about food. But it was when they reached the garden, the small patch of earth the cowboy had urged into life, that one of them paused, visibly taken aback. "Who planted this?" the man asked, not unkindly. Silence followed until the nurse stepped forward and almost inaudibly replied, "We did." Later, they were asked to gather for a photograph. The request came with polite firmness, a necessary document for the report. The women lined up near the mess hall, awkward and uncertain, their postures caught between pride and restraint. Some faces revealed a flicker of defiance, others a softness shaped by recent weeks. The nurse, holding a chipped bowl filled with freshly picked carrots, stood near the center. The cowboy hovered on the fringe, reluctant to join, wiping his hands on an old cloth. Someone gestured for him to step in. He did, hesitantly, hat in hand, squinting into the sun. The camera clicked. A brief flash, and then it was done. That photo, for many years, remained buried in archives, but when it eventually surfaced in a history book, it told a story far larger than the caption beneath it. Female Japanese POWs at U.S. Camp, 1945, Red Cross inspection. The image showed more than just women in uniform. It captured a moment suspended between endings and beginnings, faces no longer hardened by fear, a garden blooming behind them, and off to the side, the quiet silhouette of a cowboy who had never asked to be remembered. To the world, he remained nameless. Just another American cook, a man blurred at the edge of a frame. But for the women, especially for the nurse, he had become a kind of myth. Not because of what he said, but because of what he did not say. He never demanded gratitude, never asked them to forget. He only offered something better: decency without condition. That evening, after the visitors had gone and the camp had settled into dusk, the nurse stood near the garden and watched the wind move through the leaves. She thought about how history often marked itself with declarations, with battles and borders. But she had come to believe that change sometimes arrived more quietly, in bowls of stew, in songs played from a borrowed guitar, in seeds coaxed from stubborn soil. She didn't know where the cowboy would go when the war ended. Whether he would return to a ranch or vanish into the vast, unremarkable America beyond the fences. But she knew he had left something behind. Not a legacy carved into stone, but one etched in memory, of a man who showed up each day and chose kindness in a place where kindness wasn't expected. If you've made it this far and this story has moved you, give it a like and drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. When the war finally ended, it did not feel like a celebration. There were no fireworks, no banners, no tearful embraces. For the women returning to Japan, it felt like stepping into a memory that had been shattered beyond recognition. The ship carried them east, across a calm sea that betrayed nothing of the chaos waiting on shore. They had imagined this moment often: return, redemption, reunion. But the reality was harsher, colder. Their homeland lay in ruin. Cities were hollowed-out shells, homes stripped to skeletons, people too hungry to cry. Freedom, they learned, could feel lonelier than captivity. In the American camp, there had been food, routine, and, in time, a strange kind of care. Back home, there was only absence. The streets of Tokyo were shadows of the city they remembered, filled with the skeletal walk of those who had survived on weeds and scraps. The nurse, who had once trained to heal soldiers, found herself weaving through crowds of widows and orphans, unsure where she belonged. She made her way to what had once been her home, a modest wooden structure tucked behind a row of shops. It was gone. Fire had swallowed it, likely in one of the bombings that turned the night sky into red thunder. All that remained was scorched stone and ash, the ghost of a threshold. She stood at the edge of it, shoes sinking into soot, and for a long while said nothing. In her hand was a folded letter, the one she had written months earlier in the camp. She read it again, there in the silence. "They gave us stew. It smelled like smoke. I think it was made with kindness." That word, kindness, felt foreign now. Like a phrase from a dream. No one here spoke of kindness. They spoke of ration cards, of black markets, of deaths and disappearances. The stew had been a moment of warmth, but she tucked it away like a secret. Not because it was shameful, but because it was hers. When she rejoined her surviving relatives, an aunt, a cousin, a younger sister grown silent, There were questions, of course, but only the safe ones. "What did you eat? Were you beaten? Did you see Hiroshima?" She answered with careful neutrality. She did not mention the cowboy, not the guitar, not the garden. But in the kitchen something lingered. She began to cook. Not elaborate meals, the country could barely manage rice, but stews, root vegetables, charred onions, smoke and salt. Her family noticed the difference. "It tastes rich," her aunt once said. "What did you put in it?" The nurse smiled faintly. "Just whatever we have." She never said more. And yet each time she stirred the pot, she remembered. The wooden ladle in the American mess hall, the way the cowboy's stew had held warmth even after it cooled. She tried to recreate that, not just in taste, but in feeling. Meals became her quiet offering to memory, to mercy, to the idea that goodness could survive war. As years passed, she married, had children, grew older. The story of the camp became something like vapor, disappearing each time she tried to speak it aloud. But her cooking remained. Her children would one day ask why her soups always smelled faintly of smoke. She would only smile, shrug, and say it reminded her of something old. They never knew the full truth, that inside every simmering pot was the echo of a time when an enemy fed her with his own hands, not to win her over, not to confuse her, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That was her story to keep, a return without a map, guided only by the scent of something remembered. And the scent never truly left her, even as decades folded themselves into a quieter, gentler life. She grew old in a house built after the war, a home with wooden floors that creaked softly at night, and a small garden where she planted the same stubborn vegetables she once coaxed from the soil of a distant camp. Her hands aged, her hair silvered, and time carved lines of loss and resilience into her face. But the memory of that stew, that smoky warmth, never dimmed. It lingered in her the way certain songs or smells linger in childhood, lodged deeper than reason. One autumn afternoon, when the air outside smelled faintly of burning leaves and the sky had the pale softness of dusk, she stood in her kitchen with her granddaughter perched on a stool nearby. The girl watched with wide eyes as the old woman chopped onions, dried peppers, and thin slivers of pork she had salted herself. The combination puzzled her. It was not Japanese, not entirely, not miso, not soy, not dashi. Something else, something borrowed from a place far away. "What is this?" the little girl asked, wrinkling her nose as smoke curled from the pan. The old woman smiled, a small curve of lips that carried a lifetime of unspoken stories. "Something I never forgot," she said softly. She did not explain further. Instead, she added beans, stirred slowly and let the scent rise. Smoke and salt, heat and memory. The recipe was imperfect, copied not from a book, but from the fragile archive of her mind. A tribute to a man whose name she never knew, whose kindness had once surprised her into a new understanding of the world. As the stew simmered, the kitchen filled with the same warmth she remembered from the camp, that strange, unexpected comfort that had once undone the edges of her fear. When she ladled the stew into 2 small bowls and set one before her granddaughter, the girl hesitated. "It smells funny," she said, "like it's from somewhere else." The old woman nodded. "It is." The girl took a bite, slowly, thoughtfully, and then she frowned, not in disgust, but in confusion. "Why does it taste sad?" For a moment the old woman did not answer. She looked out the window toward the small garden where cabbages were pushing up through the soil, their leaves trembling in the breeze. Memory washed over her, a dusty camp, a crooked hat hanging on a nail, a guitar's lonely melody drifting across the yard. Women in uniform learning to smile again. A bowl of stew she had once feared but had swallowed anyway, discovering something she had never expected from an enemy. Gentleness. She leaned closer to her granddaughter, lowering her voice to a whisper she had never allowed herself before. "Because it saved me." The girl blinked, unsure what that meant, but sensing it was important. She didn't push for more. Children, in their innocence, sometimes understand silence better than adults. The old woman reached out and brushed a strand of hair from the girl's face, her hand trembling with age but steady in intention. From that day on, the granddaughter would remember the stew the way the old woman had, not for its taste, but for the feeling it carried. A story folded into flavor, a history softened by time, a reminder that kindness could cross even the harshest borders. The old woman would never tell the full tale, not of captivity, not of war, not of the cowboy with the gentle eyes. But each time she stirred that pot, she honored him. Each time the scent filled her kitchen, she allowed the past to breathe again. If this story touched you, please like the video and leave a comment below sharing where in the world you're watching from. These forgotten moments deserve to be remembered, one bite, one memory at a time.